State. Now, here's the AP Top 25. What is the big difference is one team that's surged way up in the top 10 and one team that dropped almost out of the top 10. Texas is now number 4. Georgia, Michigan, Florida State. SC is 5. Texas now 4. Then you see Ohio State, Penn State. We don't need to do all of them. Washington, Notre Dame, and Alabama. Let's discuss, and then there's the top 10. We'll get to the rest of them, and there's Utah, who came back to beat Baylor at number 12. Let's discuss the top 10. Everything kind of kosher with you, the way they have that lined up.
Yeah, and I'm curious to see what happens with Alabama down the road if Jalen Milroe still stays their quarterback, because they were, like Craig said, it was hard to watch them on offense for the lion's share of that game without them breaking a big play. I mean, they could not create drives, and that is very surprising for Alabama, who really, and look, some of the quarterbacks that the list of Alabama quarterbacks over the years, there's a lot of them that you probably won't even think of, like Brody Croyle or Jacob Coker or whatever. But those guys got the job done, and they've just been able to kind of more or less just move on one to the next, like just open the door and like, okay, you're next, you're next, you're next, you're next. And eventually, it catches up to everybody. And what's happened to Alabama there is indicative of larger conversation. But the most impressive teams I've seen this year, in my opinion, that I've watched, and look, Michigan hasn't played anybody yet, but I'm still going to be impressed by them. But Texas, FSU, Washington, Penn State, and Notre Dame, all in the top 10. And I've been very impressed watching the way that they play game in a game, just play in and play out.
We'll get to Milroe and Alabama's quarterback situation, but Craig, you follow that up.
Yeah, we need to, because that was tough to watch. I think one thing that's noticeable is where are all the SEC teams in the top 10? You got Georgia and Bama, and that's it. And normally you'd have there's a little bit of a downslide, so to speak. There's not quite as much of that top heaviness, and they're probably still as deep, but it's just not like 4 of the top 10, or
LSU lost their opener,
right.
So that kind of neutered them. Tennessee, of course, right there are waiting in the wings.
They've struggled a little bit compared to what had a game that you didn't think was going to be as close as it was this past weekend. And also it's others like Texas jumping up and jumping into that 4 spot that's going to cause you to shift down a little bit. But I do think that they're as deep and they're still very good, but I think with Alabama being a little bit different than what we've become accustomed to, and LSU not quite as strong, and Tennessee not quite as strong, and so there's Georgia, and there's still Georgia so far from what we've seen, although they've been unchallenged and, will be for a little while longer. Ole Miss got very close to Tulane knocking them off. It's just not a strong start. So I think, maybe that shakes out over the course of the long term. It gets back to more of what we've seen, but it's a little different that there's only a couple teams in the entire top 10, and it's 1 and it's 10. It's not 1, 4, 5, and 7 and 10, and so that's interesting. Texas deserves the jump. I mean, as far as the most impressive teams, to have the win that they had and do it in the style they had, I definitely think they were deserving of a big bump. And yeah, about the rest of it seems about right. Utah just staying steady. And they'd done this without Cam Rising, so should get him back here hopefully pretty soon. Oregon got very lucky, as we'll get to, or very fortunate that they eked out one in Lubbock. But I think obviously Colorado still sitting there and now starting to move up a little bit and deservedly so. So I think that looks about right. Miami deserving after their big win over A&M to be in the spot, and Duke as well with how they've started off. But I think it's a very eclectic and interesting mix, and only a couple weeks, so this is obviously going to shake up a lot more.
Now, I don't think there's enough evidence in this to tell you that teams with like a ton of transfers are going to win national titles yet. Yeah. But I think when you mention not a lot of SEC teams in the top 10, I think that's indicative of the transfer portal, because the rules are such now. This is very similar to, and Smokey, you will remember this more than the rest of us because you were alive when this happened, and it's not an old joke. It's just how long it's been.
It's true.
But used to, Bear Bryant and Joe Paterno and all these guys could hoard guys because there was not an 85 scholarship limit. So you could stash guys on the roster. The transfer portal now being open that you don't have to wait a year has had a similar effect on that. Look, most of the guys who transfer, like not everybody's going to be Keon Coleman or Jatavian Sanders or Adonai Mitchell, right? Those guys are rare. But the fact that you've got schools like Florida State, Colorado, Miami, it looks like they've been really good about picking the guys they have gotten out of the portal and put on their roster. That means that those guys are not at another place and they're not helping Georgia. They're not doing that. They're also not just stashed and marinating there. So,
right.
For example, Alabama has probably suffered more transfer losses.
Do you know
key
they had
guys.
a commitment from Drake May?
Yeah. So,
I mean, just imagine them if they could have kept that. They didn't, so they had to go find Milroe, who Texas wanted too.
Just think about are there 3 guys from Alabama or 2? I know JoJo Earl and Brockermeyer are at TCU right now.
Also the Sanders, the running back.
Yeah, so you got 3 guys who, look, they may not be starting for Alabama right now, but they might start for an Alabama team that was ready to win a national title when they were juniors and seniors. But now you're losing those guys when they're sophomores, so your developmental pipeline is hurt a little bit. We're going to have to change the way we look at rosters from now on because you can't just stash a guy and hope he turns out for you.
All right, you guys have had your say. I'm going to have mine, too, a little bit. Kansas State kind of just right where they probably love to be at 15. The top 25, Garrett, if you don't mind popping that up again. Oklahoma, it wasn't easy. They did beat SMU, but it wasn't like any kind of cakewalk. They're right there in the top 20. Colorado surges. That first half really against Nebraska was not pretty. It was like maybe Matt Rule and company, at least we're going to have a 17-10 game, but they just, again, too many turnovers for the handpicked quarterback in Jeff Sims, and Colorado just destroyed them in the end. Then you have Duke, solid. Washington State, good for them. Oregon State is up in the middle of all this. I mean, the Pac-12 is now 19-3 for the first couple of weeks of the season. And how about Iowa? They went into Ames, dominated Iowa State in that game. I thought they would win the game, and at times it got a little bit, but not really. They were the better team in that game, so a big win for Iowa as they're trying to kind of bounce back from a year that last year was just blah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of pack there. Starting off with SC, who I think has looked pretty good. Utah, again, just super steady and have been shorthanded here of late. They get strong and get all of their guys back. They'll be as dangerous as ever, but just keep winning and maintain your spot, and then get rising and all the rest back and start to jump up. Oregon. Looked, like they were in danger there late Saturday night, but were able to pull one out, and we'll have to talk about that at some point. But Oregon State, Washington State, as you mentioned, Colorado with what they've done, UCLA there at the end. I mean, the Pac-12, you wish it would have been like this all the time. Wish it would have been like this when the conference wasn't on, its deathbed, but if you're going to go out, it's so far through a couple of weeks, and eventually you're going to beat up on each other and knock each other, in and out of this thing. But very nice start for the conference, whether it's the schools that are hanging back, those two, or it's the schools that are on their way in various different directions.
All right, let's get to the